The transaction that would eventually dismantle the Brackett legacy began not with a grand gesture, but with a piece of paper that felt far too light for the weight of the tragedy it held. Deep within the Virginia State Archives, there exists a specific ledger from 1848 that modern researchers often overlook until they stumble upon the jarring entry for October 12th. It records a human life sold for a single dollar, a price so low it was meant as a final insult to the man being traded. To the overseer, Silas Brackett's right-hand man, this was nothing more than a way to clear the plantation of what he crudely termed industrial waste. He viewed the broken, toothless man named Jonas as a faulty machine, a gear that had finally stripped its teeth and could no longer turn the wheels of profit. The dollar was a mockery of value, a symbolic gesture to prove that in the eyes of the law, this man's worth was less than the paper the receipt was printed on. Yet, the young Eleanor Brackett saw something behind the man's eyes that the ledger failed to capture, a spark of recognition that felt like a physical blow to her chest. She stood on the porch of the great red-brick manor, a structure designed to intimidate and dominate, and made a decision that would haunt her bloodline forever. By insisting on the formality of the sale, Eleanor was unknowingly forging a weapon that would eventually be turned against her own father's absolute authority. She was 22 years old, raised in the suffocating silence of a household that mourned a mother she could barely remember, under a father whose coldness was legendary. When she produced her own personal funds to finalize the purchase, the overseer likely laughed, thinking the young mistress was simply being sentimental or perhaps a bit touched by the son. He did not realize that by allowing her to buy Jonas for $1, he was transferring legal ownership of a secret that Silas Brackett had spent 2 decades trying to bury. The ledger entry was written in Eleanor's own sharp, elegant hand, standing in stark contrast to the thick, aggressive ink her father used to track his tobacco yields. $1 was the price tag, but the true cost was hidden in the ink, a breach in the carefully constructed dam of the plantation's rigid social order. This was not a rescue mission in the traditional sense, but a collision of 2 souls that the universe had tried to keep apart through violence and distance. The atmosphere on the estate changed the moment that single dollar changed hands, as if the very air grew heavy with the anticipation of a long-delayed reckoning. Jonas was moved from the filth of the transport line to the carriage house, a move that the household staff watched with a mixture of superstitious dread and hushed curiosity. The neighbors in Petersburg would eventually whisper about the eccentric Miss Brackett and her useless purchase, speculating that her father's long absences had finally affected her mental state. They saw a crippled man who moved with a profound limp, a man whose mouth was a ruin of healed gums, but they did not see the architect of a dynasty's downfall. To the world, he was a liability, a mouth to feed that would never again pick a pound of cotton or haul a single crate of industry. To the archives, he was a statistical anomaly, a data point that disrupted the smooth, cruel curves of the plantation's economic growth charts for that fiscal year. Yet, for Eleanor, he was a magnetic north, a presence that exerted a gravitational pull on her subconscious, drawing her toward a truth she wasn't yet prepared to name. Silas Brackett had built his empire on the idea that everything had a price and that anything broken should be discarded or destroyed to maintain the illusion of perfection. He was a titan of industry who viewed his slaves as depreciating assets, and he had raised Eleanor to believe that the world was divided into those who rule and those who are used. The $1 receipt was a direct violation of that philosophy, a tiny crack in the foundation of the house that red brick and white pillars could no longer hide. It was a suicide note for the Brackett name, because once the transaction was finalized, the law of property protected the very man Silas needed to keep in the shadows. By making Jonas her legal property, Eleanor had accidentally created a sanctuary for the one person who possessed the power to strip her of her status and her name. The dollar was not an act of mercy in the eyes of the plantation system, but a clerical error that allowed a ghost to walk through the front door. This financial anomaly served as the catalyst for a psychological unraveling that would eventually leave the Grand Manor an empty shell of its former glory. The specific details of the transaction reveal a man who had been stripped of everything: his history, his voice, and even his teeth, leaving behind only a shell that the world deemed worthless. Jonas had no surname in the ledger, no record of his birth, and no previous bill of sale that could trace his origin back to the Brackett family's early days. He was a man made of silence, a cipher who existed only in the physical descriptions of his damage, yet his presence on the grounds was that of a king returning to a lost province. He navigated the complex geometry of the estate without any guidance, finding the hidden paths and the overgrown structures as if they were etched into his very bone marrow. The dollar purchase gave him the right to stand on the soil he had once bled upon, and it gave Eleanor the right to look into his eyes without the overseer's interference. This small, nominal fee was the key that unlocked the carriage house door, but it also unlocked the cellar of the Brackett family's dark and twisted history. As the days passed, the weight of that single dollar began to feel more like the weight of an entire empire, pressing down on Eleanor as she sat by the man's bedside. She found herself questioning the very nature of her reality, wondering why the useless man felt more familiar to her than the father who had provided her with every luxury. The financial transaction had created a paradox. A slave who was technically worth nothing was actually the most valuable person on the entire 3,000-acre property. His silence was not the silence of the defeated, but the silence of a man waiting for the right moment to strike a match in a room full of gunpowder. Eleanor's diary entries from this period show a woman who was slowly realizing that the dollar she spent was the most expensive purchase she would ever make in her life. She was buying her own history, piece by piece, even though she didn't yet realize that the truth would eventually cost her her social standing and her inheritance. The final realization of what that dollar had truly bought would not come until the master of the house returned, but the seeds of the empire's destruction were sown in that October sunlight. The receipt was more than a legal document. It was a curse placed upon the head of Silas Brackett, a man who believed he had successfully silenced the past. By the time the sun set on the day of the sale, the power dynamic of the estate had already begun to shift in a way that was irreversible and terrifying. The Toothless man was no longer just a cull from the fields. He was a silent witness who had been brought into the heart of the fortress he had once been expelled from. The dollar had purchased a seat at the table for a man who had been intended for the grave, and the ripples of that decision were moving toward the main house like a slow-moving tide. In the end, the Virginia State Archives would keep the receipt as a testament to a truth that could not be bought, sold, or silenced for any price. The uncanny recognition that Jonas exhibited upon his return to the estate suggested a biological impossibility that chilled the very blood of the household staff. He did not walk with the hesitant, wandering steps of a new arrival, but moved through the complex geography of the grounds with a terrifyingly innate sense of direction. Eleanor watched from the library window as the lame man bypassed the modern thoroughfares to navigate the original, hidden paths of the garden that had been overgrown for decades. It was as if the blueprint of the plantation was etched into his soul, allowing him to find the exact location of the old, boarded-up well without a single prompt. Even the current field hands, who had worked the land for years, were unaware of the stone rim hidden beneath 2 decades of thick, choking ivy. Yet Jonas pulled back the vines with his scarred hands and sat upon the crumbling masonry as if he were returning to his habitual resting place after a long day's labor. This physical memory of the landscape challenged the official narrative that he was merely a random laborer brought in to be liquidated. The most disturbing evidence of this preternatural familiarity manifested in the reaction of the plantation's large mastiffs, beasts trained specifically to be aggressive toward any unfamiliar presence. These dogs were the biological security system of the Brackett Empire, bred for ferocity and conditioned to tear apart any intruder who dared to step off the designated cedar-lined avenue. However, when Jonas approached the kennel area, the air did not fill with the expected chorus of territorial snarls or the sound of snapping jaws. Instead, the massive animals whimpered in a low, submissive frequency, lowering their bodies to the dust in a display of profound and ancient recognition. They allowed the toothless man to touch their heads with his twisted fingers, leaning into his touch as if they were acknowledging a master who had been gone for a lifetime. Eleanor documented this scene with growing alarm, realizing that the animals sensed a scent or a frequency in Jonas that transcended the passage of 20 years. This behavioral anomaly suggested that Jonas's presence was deeply encoded in the hereditary memory of the estate, making him a ghost that the animals could still see. As the days progressed, Eleanor's diary entries shifted from curiosity to a frantic, analytical search for the truth behind this man's unsettling connection to her childhood home. She observed Jonas interacting with the physical structure of the manor house itself, noting how he instinctively knew which floorboards would groan and which doors required a specific lift to open. One morning before dawn, she found him in the cellar, oiling the rusted hinges of a heavy oak door that had been jammed shut for as long as she could remember. He did not use modern tools, but found a specific hidden latch that the current carpenters had overlooked, restoring the mechanism with a methodical and quiet precision. When she questioned him, he simply pointed to his temple and then to the wood, implying that the knowledge was not learned but remembered from a time before the rot set in. This small act of repair was a symbolic reopening of the house's hidden depths, suggesting that Jonas was the only person who truly understood the architecture of the family's secrets. To Eleanor, it felt as though the house was beginning to speak through him, revealing its old wounds and its forgotten passageways to a girl who was a stranger in her own home. The psychological impact of this recognition began to manifest in Eleanor's own subconscious, as if her proximity to Jonas was unlocking doors in her mind that had been sealed since infancy. She found herself experiencing vivid sensory flashbacks triggered by the scent of the man or the specific rhythmic sound of his uneven, heavy tread on the porch. She dreamed of being held by hands that were dark and strong, hands that possessed a specific deformity she had never consciously noticed until she saw Jonas cleaning a rusted garden tool. In her dreams, a missing finger joint on a right hand held a silver rattle, a detail so specific that she woke up in a cold sweat, determined to verify the reality of the vision. When she approached Jonas and asked to see his hands, the sight of the missing pinky joint struck her with the force of a physical blow to the stomach. It was a memory stamped onto her infant retina, a biological proof that this man had been the primary caregiver during the most vulnerable months of her existence. This was not a story she had been told by her father or the nurses, but a truth that lived in the very marrow of her bones. Eleanor's hypothesis about the loyal servant began to crumble under the weight of these impossible details, as the emotional intimacy between them grew more profound and more dangerous. She noted in her blue velvet journal that when she sat near Jonas, a sense of safety and calm descended upon her that she had never felt in the presence of Silas Brackett. Her father's presence was a cold vacuum of expectation and control, while Jonas's silence felt like a warm, protective shroud that shielded her from the world's harshness. She began to wonder why the silence of a man labeled as waste felt more like a father's love than the articulate, educated words of her own legal kin and protector. She found herself neglecting her social duties and her needlework just to sit on the floor of the carriage house while Jonas whittled wood into the shapes of small, delicate animals. There was a wordless communication happening between them, a transfer of energy that bypassed the damaged vocal cords and the social barriers of the antebellum South. It was a resonance of blood and history that defied the laws of the land and the rigid hierarchies that Silas had fought so hard to maintain. The accumulation of evidence eventually pointed to a biological impossibility regarding the state of Eleanor's own physical features and the hidden truth of her parentage. As she brushed her hair in front of the vanity, she began to scrutinize the shape of her eyes and the curve of her nose with a newfound and terrifying sense of clarity. She saw the texture of her hair, which had always been described as unruly and difficult, and realized it mirrored the descriptions of her mother's family, yet possessed a different, deeper soul. She looked at her skin, which was pale enough to pass in the high society of Petersburg, but possessed a hidden capacity to tan deeply and quickly in the summer sun. For the first time in her life, she searched for the reflection of Jonas in her own face, a thought that brought a shudder of conditioned revulsion followed by a surge of undeniable recognition. The seed of the truth had been planted in the fertile soil of her mind, watered by the tears Jonas had shed in front of her mother's hidden, dusty portrait in the attic. She was beginning to realize that the biological truth Jonas carried was not a secret about a crime, but a secret about the very essence of her own existence. By the time the final confrontation arrived, the uncanny recognition had transformed Eleanor from a passive observer into an active participant in the dismantling of the Brackett legacy. She no longer viewed Jonas as a charity case or a mysterious stranger, but as a living repository of the love and the history that had been stolen from her. The house seemed to settle and groan under the weight of this realization, with the servants reporting cold spots and the scent of lavender, her mother's favorite perfume, lingering near Jonas's room. It was as if the return of the toothless man had awakened the dormant spirits of the plantation, thinning the rational boundaries of the world until the truth could no longer be contained. Jonas had become a conduit for the past, a physical bridge between the lie Eleanor had lived and the reality that Silas Brackett had tried to extract with pliers and silence. The stage was now set for the final linguistic reveal, where a single whispered word would confirm what the dogs, the garden, and Eleanor's own blood already knew to be true. The useless slave had successfully haunted the master's house from the inside, proving that some connections are too deep for even the most brutal systems of oppression to sever. The accumulation of evidence regarding Jonas's condition pointed toward a biological impossibility that necessitated a formal medical inquiry within the quiet walls of the estate. Eleanor summoned a visiting physician to perform a routine checkup, hoping to find a rational cause for the man's profound silence and physical decay. The resulting medical ledger, written in the doctor's detached and clinical hand, provided a chilling contrast to the sentimental theories Eleanor had previously entertained. The doctor noted that the man's mouth was entirely devoid of teeth, but not due to the natural progression of age, decay, or scurvy. Instead, the gums were smooth and perfectly healed, indicating that the teeth had been removed forcefully and systematically many years in the past. There were no remaining stumps or signs of the jagged rot that usually accompanied the dental neglect found among the laboring classes. This was not the wear and tear of a hard life spent in the fields, but a deliberate act of anatomical erasure. The procedure had been performed with a level of precision that suggested a cold, calculated intent to transform the man into a living silence. Upon further examination, the physician discovered that Jonas's vocal cords appeared to have suffered severe, localized trauma that had effectively stripped him of his voice. The doctor's notes described the interior of the throat as a landscape of scar tissue, likely the result of a singular violent event designed to stifle sound. This explained why Jonas spoke only in a harsh, breathless whisper that seemed to rattle in his chest like dry leaves against a gravestone. It was a physical manifestation of a secret so volatile that his captors believed it had to be physically cut out of him. The brutality was performative and specific, aimed at the tools of communication rather than the capacity for labor, which confused the doctor's traditional understanding of punishment. In the rigid economy of the plantation, such a targeted mutilation was an expensive and inefficient use of violence, unless the goal was total suppression. Eleanor read these findings with a growing sense of horror, realizing that the man she bought for $1 was a victim of a surgical conspiracy. The field hands who lived in the distant quarters seemed to possess their own understanding of Jonas's scars, treating his broken body with a reverence that baffled the white staff. They began to leave small, symbolic offerings near the carriage-house door, such as bundles of dried tobacco, intricately carved corn dolls, and specific bird feathers. When the overseer questioned them about these tributes, the workers claimed they were simply paying respects to a man they recognized as a spiritual authority. To the enslaved community, Jonas was not a cull or a piece of industrial waste, but an elder whose suffering had elevated him to the status of a living martyr. They saw the missing teeth and the ruined voice not as signs of weakness, but as the badges of a man who had survived a battle they all understood. Their collective memory had preserved a version of Jonas that Silas Brackett had spent 2 decades trying to drown in the depths of the archives. This cross-plantation reverence suggested that the story of Jonas's mutilation was a legend that had been whispered in the quarters long before his return. As Eleanor delved deeper into the plantation's old household receipts, she found further evidence that Jonas's status had once been vastly different from his current broken state. She discovered a scrap of paper from 1825 that listed the purchase of fine wool and silk thread intended for a house servant's formal livery. The name Jonas was clearly written beside the order, confirming that he had once walked the halls of the manor in the finest attire the estate could provide. This revelation shattered the image of Jonas as a common field hand, placing him directly within the intimate inner circle of her mother's domestic life. It suggested that his current condition was a fall from grace so steep and so violent that it could only have been motivated by a betrayal of the highest order. The fine wool of the past was a haunting ghost when compared to the rags he now wore, highlighting the extreme measures taken to degrade his humanity. Eleanor realized that the mutilation was not just about silence, but about stripping away every vestige of the man who had once been respected. The doctor also noted a series of scars on Jonas's back that did not follow the typical pattern of the overseer's lash, which usually left horizontal or diagonal welts. These marks were vertical and deep, suggesting they were inflicted by someone standing directly over him, perhaps in a fit of personal rage rather than a formal disciplinary action. The physician's report remarked on the singularly personal nature of the wounds, which appeared to have been delivered with a weapon not commonly used for field punishment. This detail added another layer to the mystery, suggesting that the architect of Jonas's pain was not a hired hand, but someone with a personal vendetta. Eleanor began to suspect that the violence had been an intimate exchange, a desperate attempt by a jealous or terrified man to exert total dominance over a rival. The physical evidence was beginning to form a map of a crime that was as much about psychological breaking as it was about physical damage. Every scar told a story of a struggle that had taken place in the shadows of the nursery and the private chambers of the great house. Inside the carriage house, Jonas remained a quiet observer of his own medical assessment, showing neither fear nor resentment toward the doctor's invasive and cold examinations. He sat with a stoic dignity that made the clinical surroundings feel small and insignificant, as if his spirit had long ago retreated to a place where pain could not follow. When the doctor touched the scarred tissue of his throat, Jonas did not flinch, but kept his gaze fixed on Eleanor with an intensity that seemed to communicate more than words ever could. It was a look of profound patience, the expression of a witness who knew that the truth was a slow-acting poison that would eventually find its way to the surface. The physician eventually left the estate with a look of confusion, unable to reconcile the man's worthless status with the high-stakes brutality etched into his very flesh. Eleanor was left alone with the report, a document that proved her father was not just a harsh master, but potentially a surgeon of human misery. The mutilation mystery was no longer a matter of speculation. It was a recorded fact that demanded a reckoning between the daughter and the father. The final piece of the medical puzzle was the discovery of a small, crescent-shaped burn mark on Jonas's left forearm, a detail the doctor had initially dismissed as a common accident. To Eleanor, however, this mark was the key that unlocked a fragmented memory of a fire in the nursery that had occurred when she was only a few months old. She recalled a story of a servant who had reached into the flames to save a child, a hero whose name had been conveniently erased from the family's oral history. Seeing that scar on the man she had bought for $1 brought the disparate pieces of her life into a sharp and terrifyingly clear focus. The man had been silenced not because he was a criminal, but because his very existence was a testament to a love and a bravery that Silas Brackett could not claim. The teeth were gone, so he could not tell the story, and the voice was ruined, so he could not call her name, but the scars remained as an indelible record. The physician's ledger had unintentionally provided the blueprints for the uprising that was about to occur within the heart of the Brackett household. The return of Silas Brackett to the estate on November 1st transformed the simmering tension into a psychological war zone that threatened to dismantle every social pillar of the county. Upon his arrival, the patriarch did not find a submissive daughter or a well-ordered plantation, but a household gripped by a radical and terrifying inversion of the established racial hierarchy. The air in the main hall was thick with the scent of expensive brandy and the sharp, metallic tang of unbridled patriarchal fury as Silas processed the sight of Jonas. He did not react with the annoyance of a master seeing a stray animal, but with a paralyzing, corpse-pale terror that signaled a deep and ancient recognition of his own sins. Eleanor stood her ground in the center of the foyer, holding the $1 receipt as if it were a shield of armor against her father's legendary and obsidian coldness. This was the first time in 22 years that the daughter had looked the titan of industry in the eye and refused to blink in the face of his wrath. The social contract of the antebellum aristocracy was being shredded in real time, replaced by a raw and desperate struggle for dominance over a man labeled as waste. In a move that sent shockwaves through the local community, Eleanor decided to escalate the conflict by moving Jonas from the carriage house directly into the main manor. She assigned him to a small sewing room located immediately adjacent to her own bedchamber, a spatial proximity that violated every unspoken law of Southern etiquette and decorum. By bringing a male slave into the private, feminine quarters of the house, she was effectively detonating a nuclear option within the rigid social structure of 1848 Virginia. This was not merely an act of defiance. It was a public declaration that she no longer recognized the boundaries her father had spent a lifetime reinforcing with iron and blood. The household staff, who moved through the hallways like shadows, whispered about the mad mistress and the silent, toothless ghost who now occupied the heart of the home. Even the neighbors in Petersburg began to receive filtered reports of the scandal, painting Eleanor as a woman who had lost her sanity to the isolation of the estate. Silas paced the hallway outside her door, his riding crop slapping against his leather boots in a rhythmic, threatening cadence that echoed like a ticking clock. The social fracture extended far beyond the walls of the Brackett manor, alienating the very religious and political institutions that had previously anchored the family's high status. A delegation of church elders, concerned about the spiritual health of the young mistress, arrived at the gates only to be met by a woman they no longer recognized. Eleanor did not invite them in for tea or seek their counsel. She met them at the threshold with a cold, steely resolve and told them that God was watching. She insisted that the true sinners were not those who offered shelter to the broken, but those who used the law to hide the most terrifying of human truths. Her rejection of religious authority was the final blow to her reputation, ensuring that she would be permanently cast out of the social circles she was born to lead. She was now a pariah in her own county, but the isolation only seemed to strengthen the bond she shared with the silent man in the sewing room. Inside the house, the atmosphere became warlike, with meals taken in a suffocating silence that was more expressive than any shouting match could ever be. Silas Brackett, unable to legally seize Jonas without provoking a public scandal that would expose his own past, began to employ a strategy of slow, calculated starvation and psychological pressure. He cut off all official supplies to the carriage house and the sewing room, forcing Eleanor to smuggle food and medicine like a common criminal in her own home. He hoped to break her spirit by making the physical maintenance of Jonas's life an unbearable burden that would eventually lead to her surrender and his total control. However, Eleanor responded by arming herself with a pistol taken from her father's own mahogany desk, keeping a constant vigil over the man who held the keys to her history. She spent hours in the sewing room with Jonas, engaging in one-sided conversations that felt more like a spiritual confession than a traditional interaction between mistress and slave. The hierarchy of power had completely dissolved, leaving only two human beings waiting for the inevitable explosion that would determine which of them would survive the night. The plantation was now a house divided against itself, teetering on the edge of a collapse that would be as spectacular as it was inevitable. The household staff's oral histories, recorded decades later, speak of a heavy, supernatural silence that descended over the grounds the moment Jonas entered the main house's interior. They described cold spots in the hallways and the persistent scent of lavender, the favorite perfume of the long-dead Caroline, lingering in the air near the sewing-room door. It was as if the structural timbers of the manor were groaning under the weight of the secret that was now physically housed within its brick and mortar. The slaves in the distant fields stopped singing their traditional work songs, replaced by a quiet, expectant hum that seemed to vibrate through the very soil of the tobacco fields. They recognized that a reckoning was coming, a shifting of the earth that would either swallow them all or finally set the truth free from its prison. The overseers walked with their hands perpetually on their pistols, sensing that the old order was breathing its last, ragged breaths in the cold November air. Every interaction between the staff and the family was now fraught with a tension that made even the simplest tasks feel like an act of high-stakes political theater. As the escalation reached its zenith, Silas ordered the plantation blacksmith to forge a set of heavy iron chains specifically designed for Jonas's small and frail frame. He claimed the man was a flight risk and a danger to the community, a performative display of cruelty intended to remind Eleanor of who truly held the power of life and death. Eleanor watched from the library window as the chains were delivered, their clanking sound a grim herald of the violence her father was still capable of inflicting on those he hated. Instead of retreating, she locked herself in the sewing room with Jonas, creating a fortress within a fortress that Silas could not enter without committing a final, public act of domestic war. The sight of the chains only served to harden Eleanor's heart against the man she had once called father, turning her grief into a sharp and deadly weapon of revenge. She realized that the chains were not for Jonas's legs, but were a desperate attempt by Silas to bind the truth that was already escaping his control. The social horror had reached its breaking point, leaving no room for compromise or a return to the comfortable lies of the previous 20 years. The final night before the truth was spoken was marked by a violent thunderstorm that seemed to mirror the internal chaos of the Brackett family's crumbling empire. Inside the manor, the candles flickered and dimmed in the presence of Jonas, as if the light itself was struggling to remain upright in the face of such profound human suffering. Eleanor sat by the bedside, the cold steel of the pistol in her lap and the $1 receipt tucked into the bodice of her simple, unadorned dress. She had shed the frivolous layers of her station, appearing as raw and exposed as the man she was determined to protect from her father's murderous and desperate rage. Silas paced the hallway like a caged tiger, his shadow stretching across the floorboards in long, distorted shapes that looked like the bars of a prison cell. The air was thick with the anticipation of a lightning strike, a moment of clarity that would either burn the house to the ground or illuminate the path to freedom. The taboo of Jonas's presence had become the catalyst for a total transformation of Eleanor's soul, preparing her for the moment when the slave would finally speak her true and secret name. The storm finally broke on the evening of November 7, 1848, with a violence that matched the internal collapse of the Brackett dynasty. Silas, fueled by days of heavy drinking and the frantic desperation of a man whose secrets were rotting from within, kicked open the door to Eleanor's room. He did not come to negotiate or to argue, but to finish the brutal work he had started 20 years earlier when he first attempted to erase Jonas. Eleanor threw herself between the two men, leveling the heavy mahogany pistol at her father's chest with a hand that did not tremble. The scene was frozen in a terrifying tableau. The patriarch, the defiant daughter, and the broken slave locked in a triangle of death. Silas screamed that Jonas was a filth and a disease that he had once successfully cut out of the house like a cancer. He raised his riding crop, ready to strike down his own flesh and blood to reach the man who haunted his conscience. The air in the room seemed to vanish, leaving a vacuum of sound and motion as the two Bracketts faced one another in the dark. It was in this moment of peak tension that the silence of 2 decades was finally shattered by a sound that felt entirely supernatural. Jonas stood up from the edge of the cot, and despite his shattered leg, he rose with a dignity that mirrored the master's own stature. He looked at Silas with a gaze that held no fear, then turned his eyes toward Eleanor, who was still shielding him with her body. He opened his mouth, and the ruin of his gums was visible in the flickering lamplight, a testament to the price he had paid for his existence. He took a breath that rattled deep in his scarred throat, forcing air through the vocal cords that Silas had tried to destroy with clinical precision. He did not plead for mercy or cry out in pain, nor did he address the man who had stolen his life for $1. With a supreme effort of will, he whispered a single word that carried the weight of a physical blow to Eleanor's heart. "Elodie," he breathed, the sound rasping like dry parchment, but carrying a tender, paternal inflection that defied his physical state. The impact of that single word on Eleanor was one of total physical and emotional paralysis, as the pistol wavered and finally dropped to her side. Elodie was not her name to the world, nor was it recorded in the family Bible or the official parish records of the county. It was a secret pet name that her mother, Caroline, had whispered to her in the cradle, a private sound that had died with her. No living soul in the state of Virginia knew that name, and Silas Brackett had notoriously detested it, never once uttering it in the decades since. For this toothless, broken man to know that sound and speak it with such intimate familiarity shattered the reality of the room in an instant. Silas let out a sound that was half gasp and half sob, collapsing against the doorframe as his rage was punctured by the undeniable proof of intimacy. The word acted as a key, unlocking a flood of sensory memories in Eleanor that confirmed the biological truth she had long suspected. The linguistic reveal was the final evidence that the man she bought for $1 was the keeper of her mother's most private soul. Jonas did not stop with a name. He reached into his tunic and pulled out a small, jagged object that he had kept hidden against his skin. It was a piece of red coral shaped like a heart, a distinct charm from a necklace that Eleanor had seen her mother wearing in the attic portrait. That necklace had supposedly been lost in the chaos following Caroline's death, a detail Silas had used to explain its disappearance from the family jewels. Jonas held it out to Eleanor with a hand that was calloused and missing a finger joint, offering it not as a servant, but as a father. The realization did not come as a question or a doubt, but as a landslide that buried the lie of her entire aristocratic upbringing. The familiarity of his eyes, the shape of his hands, and the unconditional love in his gaze all slammed into a singular, undeniable fact. Jonas was not a servant who had loved her mother. He was the man her mother had loved in return, the architect of her own blood. The whiteness of Eleanor's skin was merely a genetic roll of the dice, a facade that had allowed her to live as a Brackett. Eleanor looked at Silas, seeing him for the first time not as a father or a protector, but as a kidnapper and a common jailer of souls. "You knew," she whispered, her voice colder and more hollow than the grave as she stared at the man who had raised her in a lie. "You knew he was my blood, and you sold him for $1 to keep your pride and your plantation intact," she continued with growing venom. Silas's silence was his ultimate confession, a hollow admission that he had been unable to commit murder but had settled for a slower, crueler death. He had kept Eleanor as his own to maintain his social standing, while mutilating and enslaving the man who had actually given her life and safety. The empire was built on the back of this stolen paternity, a structure of red brick that was now dissolving in the acid of the truth. Every luxury Eleanor had ever known was now revealed as a bribe, a payment for a silence that had finally been broken in a sewing room. The power dynamic had shifted forever, leaving the titan of industry a broken old man cowering in the shadow of the slave. The aftermath of the reveal was a swift and total dismantling of the Brackett estate, as Eleanor refused to spend another night under the roof of a murderer. She used the remainder of her funds and the legal protection of her property rights to secure a passage for herself and Jonas away from Virginia. The plantation was left to rot, as Silas descended into a permanent state of alcoholic madness, haunted by the ghost of the man he couldn't kill. The servants and field hands watched in silence as the mad mistress walked out of the gates with the toothless man leaning on her arm for support. They carried nothing but the coral heart and the $1 receipt, the two most valuable items in a world that had tried to value them at zero. The story of their departure became a legend in the quarters, a tale of a linguistic miracle that had turned a master into a ghost. They disappeared into the north, leaving behind a ruined manor and a ledger entry that would puzzle historians for the next 2 centuries. The transaction was complete, and the price of the truth had finally been paid in full by the dynasty that tried to suppress it. Today, the Brackett Manor stands as a crumbling ruin in the Virginia woods, a skeletal remains of a power that was undone by a single whispered word. The archives still hold the receipt, a fragile piece of paper that defies logic until one understands the biological war that was fought over its ink. Jonas lived out his final years in freedom, his silence replaced by the devoted care of the daughter who had recognized him through the scars. Eleanor never returned to the life of a plantation mistress, choosing instead to live in the truth of her lineage rather than the comfort of a lie. The story serves as a terrifying reminder that the most volatile truths are often those hidden in the margins of history, waiting for someone to listen. Silas Brackett died alone in the house he had turned into a prison, surrounded by the echoes of a name he could never bear to hear again. The empire was worth millions, but the soul of the family was sold for $1 and redeemed by a whisper in the dark. The biological truth had won, proving that blood is a memory that cannot be extracted by force or silenced by a master's lash.